Hello, welcome to this webinar. My name is Malcolm Tyrrell. I'm from, as it says on the screen there, Just. And this morning, for the next 35-40 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about primarily lifetime mortgages, but within a strategy for managing wealth. Before we get to all of that kind of stuff, I'm going to have a look at where we're at with the equity release market at the moment, not in great detail, but just to give you a flavor for those of you that may not be immersed in equity release on a day-to-day basis. I'll give you an idea of where we're going with this business, because it has changed enormously, really in the last 5 years. We've seen an awful lot of change since 1991, but the last 5 years has seen huge growth. And there is no question, as a result of what's been happening throughout the world in the last year or so, that growth has been increased at an enormous rate. I was talking to our new business people earlier this week. On a normal day at Just, we would expect to get something around 20 applications on a good day. We're receiving about 50 a day, which we have never seen before. It is extraordinary, and it's pretty indicative, I think, of where this market is going, what it's drawing in, and why it's so important to be aware of what equity release can do for clients and for businesses generally. So without further ado, I don't have objectives generally. I don't normally go through learning objectives either. The reason I'm going to briefly mention these is because I'm going to use them as a sort of an agenda. So as I say, for the first part of the session, what we'll look at is the market, the growth, the changing attitudes, why things have grown so hugely in the last 4, 5, 6 years, as I say. We'll look at what's driving those changes. And then for the last 20 minutes or so, I want to look at a couple of case studies to give you an idea of how this can work for high net worth individuals. It's only a smallish part of the market, but it's growing enormously, and it's something that I think you need to be aware of. I'll give you a heads up warning now. When we get to that bit, I'm going to be throwing an awful lot of figures at you. I'll talk you through them very quickly, and it's only really the figures at the bottom of the screen that we're interested in, because it's trying to make the point of what this is all about, rather than looking at the figures in detail. Anyway, I'll stop waffling. You'll see what I mean when I get there in just a moment. For those of you that are out there in advisory world, you don't need me to tell you how to do fact finding and the kind of stuff that you need to ask. The only reason I've got these couple of slides, you'll see it again on the next one in this presentation, is that in the summer, I can't remember exactly when it was, but during the summer of last year, we had a report come out from the regulator looking at lifetime mortgages, the advice around lifetime mortgages, etc., etc. And I think, reading between the lines, I think they were actually quite pleased at what they found. I think they were expecting to see a bit of a nightmare, appalling advice, etc., etc., and frankly, they didn't. So they had to dig quite deep in order to come up with some suggestions or some ideas that could improve on what they saw. And pretty much, if I were to give you an executive summary in a few lines, pretty much what they wanted to see more of was advisors asking soft fact questions. But more importantly, what they wanted to see was those soft fact questions identified in writing. In other words, within a report scenario. I have no doubt that advisors out there are asking these questions. What they may not be doing, and this is what the regulator picked up on, is they may not be indicating that they asked those questions because they didn't feel it was a relevant part of the report. The regulator is saying completely the opposite. When it comes to equity release, if you're giving advice, please, 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 or if you're supervising advice, please, please, please make sure that you are able to see these types of questions, and I'll cover off a few of them as we go. But more importantly, that those are documented. And the other point that the regulator made was that they wanted to see them documented in what they called the voice of the customer. I hate using the word customer, but anyway, let's just go with it because that's what the regulator said. So what they want to see is the voice of the customer. So things like in a report, we spoke to, we spoke about the client's attitude to retaining capital. The client said this. So that's what they're looking to see going forward. So if you pick nothing else up out of this session, please make sure that going forward, your reports are asking soft questions, indicating that you've asked those soft questions, and that those soft questions are clearly identified within the report in the response that you got from your client. So things like talking about what is the client's attitude to capital? Have they got any? Is it likely to remain there? If it isn't going to remain there, what are they doing with it? Why do they need more capital if that's what they want from the equity release? How flexible, I hate that word flexibility as well, because what does it actually mean? But how flexible do they need that capital to be? Do they need access to it on a regular basis, on an irregular basis? The same with income. How much income has the client currently got? How much income are they likely to have at some point in the near future? What about in the medium to long-term future? Is that income going to go up? Is it going to go down? Is it going to remain the same? Do they want more? Do they want less? All these kind of things have to be identified before equity release advice can be given. Do they want to leave a legacy? Given the option, of course, assuming there's somebody to leave it to, yes, they are, of course, going to want to leave something in the form of death benefits. But do they know that getting involved in equity release could have an impact on the amount that would be available to beneficiaries? Do they want to defer what they're doing at the moment? Do they want to defer their income? Do they want to defer access to all this kind of stuff? Have they considered annuitization? Do they even know what annuitization is? The fact that you can provide them with a guaranteed income, all this kind of stuff. Is this the kind of thing that they want instead of equity release? All these kind of things, soft facts have to be identified and then reported on. What they also went on to say was are all these details being taken into account? Are all the assets that are available clearly identified, and have they been taken into account in terms of well, can these be used as an alternative? As I say, you don't need me to tell you how to do all that fact-finding stuff, but the kind of things I'm talking about here are what other assets are available. And for example, if a client turns around and says, well, yeah, we've got a few quid stashed away in a savings plan, but we don't want to touch that because that's for a rainy day. The response from the advisor should be at that stage, look around, it's raining. If you need me to provide you with more cash stroke capital, and you already have some, why aren't you using that first before you come to me for further cash and or income and or capital? Hopefully you get the point. You've got to be quite tough and be seen to be quite tough with clients, because what is not acceptable is for an advisor to simply say, yep, you can have as much as you want whenever you want it, and here's the facility to enable you to do that, i.e. a lifetime mortgage or home reversion arrangement. That's not right. What they have to do is dig deep, make sure that all the soft facts are uncovered, all the stones are unturned, etc., etc. And what the regulator also discovered in that report that I mentioned earlier was that, in their opinion, the property was not often considered in sufficient terms as an alternative asset. The assets were viewed as all the stuff on the left-hand side of the screen there, and the property was, oh, well, yeah, you've also got a property, that's great. Was it viewed as an asset? Was it viewed as something that can actually be used if needs be? Not right for every client, but if it was the right thing in the right circumstance. And of course, what we know has happened, and you may have seen something like this before, is that People who are eligible for equity release, i.e. those age 55 plus in the UK, will have probably owned a property as indicated by this graph. This goes back to 1991. And if you bought an average 3-bed semi in 1991, that would have cost you £54,500. That same property at the end of 2020, assuming you'd maintained it, kept it in decent nick, etc., would now be worth the best part of £230,000. And the vast majority of people will have owned a property during this enormous growth period. We only had one proper blip, and that was, of course, during the recession between 2007, 2010, something like that. Other than that, UK property has been a fantastic place to invest. Whether you saw it as an investment or whether you saw it as, well, we've got to have somewhere to live, doesn't really matter. The chances are, if you've owned a property or properties during that period, you will have done extremely well, and the return on it would be extremely good. So hence the reason we're now in a situation where there are huge amounts of money held in property for the older individual. And I can give you an indication as to what that is. This goes back to 2018, but the figures are still highly relevant. And the way this pie chart is made up is that it indicates through various age groups represented by the colors that the net housing wealth held by those over the age of 55. So in other words, we've taken out all the debt, interest only mortgages, all that, anything that might be secured on the property, and the net housing wealth is about £3 trillion. We're not even talking billions anymore. This is now in the trillions. Don't tell Richie Sunak, but he could wipe out the national debt if he nationalised property. Hopefully that'll never happen. And I'm never going to mention that again, of course, but you get the point. And what I want to do on this particular graph is draw your attention to the two biggest chunks of that pie, the top right and the one at the bottom. And what that indicates that between the ages of 55 and 74, what you can see is that more than £2 trillion of net housing wealth is held just in those two groups. And what we're finding, and I'll show you some indication of this in just a moment, what we're finding is that more and more people are considering using equity release at a younger age than ever before. We used to consider equity release standard age to be sort of late 70s through to early 80s. That is now very much not the case. And we're seeing younger and younger individuals, those in their late 50s and all the way through their 60s, as becoming the more common element of the equity release, or the more common demographic, I should say, of the equity release market. And you can see probably why that's the case. More people are aware of equity release, more advisors are aware of equity release, and the regulator has quite clearly stated that, as opposed to their view even 5 or 6 years ago, when their statement was quite categorically equity release as a last resort sale, the regulator is now saying without any shadow of a doubt that equity release should form part of all later life planning. Without exception, it should be included as one of those assets, and should be discussed as to whether that asset can be used to benefit those individuals in retirement. To do whatever they want with, that's a whole different story, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But it's now part of, again, it's not an expression I particularly like, holistic planning. Property should now be included in every instance with every older client. And by older, I would suggest we're talking over the age of 50. Here's that evidence that I talked about earlier. As I say, 5, 6 years ago, the regulator's attitude was equity release is a last resort sale. You can see even back in 17, they were saying things like there is likely to be increased demand for products that allow older people to tap into housing wealth. In the future, this could include the aging younger generations who may have lower pension holdings. There are all sorts of other reasons why people will consider using equity release, and we'll come on to those in just a moment. But hopefully that indicates that the regulator is now saying, yep, we fully appreciate that equity release now should form part of a full review of a client's finances. So what are people using equity release for? This will give you some idea if you're not already familiar. We've broken it down into those same pie chart groups. And you can see that a number of them repeat as we go through. But you can see now that things like paying off interest-only mortgages is a huge part of this market. I don't know if you've seen the figures, but there is an enormous number of people in the hundreds of thousands every year for the next decade that will come to the end of their interest-only mortgage period, and will have to make a decision about what they're going to do. Now, there are some mortgage providers out there that will reconsider and allow them to extend the mortgage, but those are becoming fewer and fewer, and generally you can only do that once. So if you've come to the end of that extended to two or 3 year period, you've got to make a consideration as to what on earth you're going to do. My experience of this is that the vast majority of people have made no provision for what they're going to do in these circumstances. They read their Daily Mail 15 years ago and cancelled their endowment because that's what the Daily Mail told them to do. Okay, I'm being slightly glib, but you get the point. Fewer and fewer people have got, if they've an interest-only mortgage, any means of repaying this. They're going to come to the end of that period and go, crikey, what asset have I got that I can use to repay this mortgage? And for the vast majority of people, their biggest asset will be their property. They're going to have to use their property to repay an interest-only mortgage. So they're going to have to go down a lifetime mortgage route. Paying off unsecured debt, you could see huge amounts of people are now using it for those purposes. And there is no question we're seeing more and more people coming into the retirement period, be it semi-retired or fully retired, firstly younger than they ever have previously, but with more unsecured debt than we've ever seen. More and more people have got more and more credit card debt than ever before, with no real means of repaying this, particularly once their regular income ceases. They're going to have to use equity release. Paying for home improvements has always been the biggest chunk of equity release. I've been working in equity release now for over a decade, and 2/3 of equity release monies throughout the whole of that decade plus have been used for home improvements. Now, that's not just having the roof repaired or the place decorated or a nice conservatory stuck on the back of the house, although it does include all of those things, of course. What that also includes are adaptations to the property for disability purposes. So things like installation of a wet room, building or putting in a standard stair lift. Other stair lifts are available. Lowering of work surfaces for wheelchairs, ramps, widening of doors, all this kind of stuff would all be included in that. And that has not changed. So if you are relatively new to this market, please recognize, because with respect, your clients won't be different to anybody else. They will be looking to use equity release for, or part of the money anyway, for home improvements of some kind. Paying off other mortgage debt, I've already mentioned. Access to money without having to downsize. Most people will reach the point where if they're living in a 3, 4, 5 bedroom house, will go, what on earth are we living in a 3, 4, 5 bedroom house for when there's only now the two of us? And they will go, right, we need to downsize. We need to downsize to a 2-bed bungalow. They'll then recognize that a 2-bed bungalow costs them as much as a 4 or 5 bedroom house, because the demand for 2-bedroom bungalows is enormous, because everybody's doing the same thing. And there are an awful lot of people in this demographic who are reaching the age where they're living in big houses on their own and need to downsize. So the likelihood is they probably wouldn't do that, because when you chuck in solicitors' fees and moving fees and stamp duty, of course, it's just not worth it. So an awful lot of people will consider moving to a smaller property and then go, oh, what the heck, we'll stay where we are, but we can't afford it. So they'll look at equity release. So all this kind of stuff. The other thing I want to mention, which is the one in the middle there, which is highlighted, which is sort of where I'm going for the rest of this presentation, is helping family and friends, more particularly helping family, because what we're finding, certainly in the last 5 years, is that equity release, or the use of equity release, is becoming intergenerational. And what I mean by that is that the clients, the borrowers, let's call them in this instance the grandparents, are using equity release often as a lifetime inheritance arrangement. Their attitude is, look, they're talking to their sons and their grandkids now, their sons and daughters and their grandkids, and they're saying, look, you're going to get the money when I die. That's what the rules say. But you need the money now. You've got debts, you've got credit cards, you've got mortgages, you've got kids to raise. The grandkids can't afford to get on the property ladder. They can't afford to pay off their student loans. So the grandparents are saying, look, you're going to get this money anyway. Why don't we consider using it now, getting our hands on it now? It's tax-free. We can do what the hell we want with it. Why shouldn't we clear your debts? It makes us feel good as grandparents because we can see the money doing something while we're still alive. And it does good as far as you guys are concerned, because you can live a debt-free life going forward, and or the grandkids can get their first property because they've now got a decent deposit that their grandparents have given them. So what you'll see is that more and more people, and that's why it's becoming a younger market, because more and more people are recognizing what equity release can do, the fact that it's tax-free and you can do what you like with it within reason. I do accept there are things that are highly unacceptable and not possible, but within reason you can do pretty much, certainly all this stuff on this list. So again, if you're relatively new to this market, please consider not just the grandparents, let's call them that, but also what the grandparents can do for the children and for the grandchildren. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the types of equity release. Again, I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs here. The reason I'm putting this screen up is just to remind you that whilst I am talking primarily about lifetime mortgage, because that's the product that fits nicely going forward, and I'll explain that as we get there in just a moment. Please, 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 as an advisor, as a compliance manager, or whatever role you fulfill within the equity release advice arena, please don't forget that home reversions exist. Now, home reversions only makes up a very small part of the market, probably less than 5%. But if it's right for the client, it's the right product. And the point I'm trying to make here is that please make sure when giving equity release advice or supervising equity release advice, that home reversion has formed part of that advice process, that the client is fully informed about what a home reversion plan is, what a home reversion plan does, and how it works. The chances are, and the reason this only represents 5% or less than 5% of the market, is that as soon as they are told they have to sell part or all of their property and they'll live in that property as a tenant, that's when most people will go, actually, let's consider lifetime mortgage. But please, please, please make sure that home reversion is in there, is part of the report, and the clients are fully aware of what home reversion is, even if it doesn't meet their needs. The client said this, I said this, the client said that. Make sure it's there in the client's own words, or the customer's own words, as the regulator says. So for the last part of this session, what I want to do is concentrate on what I was talking about in what people are using equity release for, and this intergenerational usage. They're using it as lifetime inheritance planning. And what I want to do is concentrate on a fairly niche-ish part of the market that is expanding beyond all belief at the moment. And that is using equity release, specifically lifetime mortgages. It doesn't really work with home reversions, but specifically lifetime mortgages where high net worth individuals are considering using some form of wealth management to distribute their wealth to mitigate specifically IHT. It's perfectly legal, it is perfectly acceptable, and there are lots of ways of doing it. I'm going to look at two ways, and what all I want to do is show you these case studies and let you decide whether you feel it's an appropriate use of funds or whatever. But let's have a look at Paula. Paula is age 72. She's widowed. She's got 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. They are the people that she is trying to design this arrangement around. Those are her real concerns. What will happen? What taxes will they have to pay? And the reason she's concerned about it is because she lives in Chelsea and she's got a property valued at £7 million. In addition to that, she's got a modest investment portfolio of about 100,000. She already has a wealth advisor, and she has been talking about her concerns, specifically the amount of tax that her beneficiaries may have to pay in the event of a demise, and also the fact that because she's now widowed, her income has dropped, and she would like to find a way of not only helping out the sons and grandchildren, but also supplementing her income. She's already made the decision that she doesn't want to downsize. This is the family home. This is where she wants to stay, and we'll assume for the purposes of this case study that her advisor has covered off all the other things like taking in a lodger and downside, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we'll assume that that's all been done. So as a result of all of that lot, her advisor recommends using the property to help with passing funds on tax efficiently to her grandkids and supplementing her pension income. The way she proposes is that she recommends a lifetime mortgage for £1 million, with the proceeds being used or placed into a discounted gift scheme to reduce her estate because of the way discounted gifts work and provide an additional income stream. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with trusts, it doesn't matter. Just hang in there. You'll see how all this works in just a moment. What we're doing here is we're just looking at this as a principle. Would using a lifetime mortgage in conjunction with a discounted gift trust scheme work? Well, let's have a look at the figures. For those of you that are not familiar with discounted gift trusts, on the right-hand side, I won't go through them in great detail, but basically they fit perfectly in this scenario because they are used for, they're perfectly accepted use for tax planning. There is no challenge here. These are perfectly acceptable items or methods. So a discounted gift trust basically is an IHT planning arrangement for those who want income and want to mitigate IHT. Hence the reason for this example, it's perfect for Paula. Basically, the lump sum that comes from the lifetime mortgage is gifted into a trust, and the income is then treated as retained interest because within the trust, it's placed into bond or bonds. Those bonds allow, by law, a 5% tax deferred income to be paid. So that's what we want to take advantage of for her income, and also the fact that those bonds are discounted. Don't worry about all the technology at this stage, all the technical language, but because they're underwritten, they are discounted for her age and all the rest of it, and they have an immediate tax advantage because the amount that's transferred across from the lifetime mortgage is treated as leaving the estate on day one. Hence the reason it gives an immediate IHT saving. So with that in mind, that's why for this example, we've gone down a discounted gift trust route. For those of you that are very experienced in trusts, we appreciate there are loads of other trust methods out there. We just felt for this one, it worked perfectly. So her advisor says, Paula couldn't benefit from this strategy without accessing her property wealth via the lifetime mortgage. That's what's raising the lump sum that is going into the trust. In common with most IHT gifting strategies, the capital raised will end up invested or by or for the benefit of the beneficiaries, in this case in the DGT plan. Okay, so what I want to look at are two scenarios. What happens if Paula dies tomorrow, and what happens if Paula survives 10 years? And we'll look at it from two perspectives: that she did nothing, she didn't put a strategy in place, and she did. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. This is where I'm going to throw a lot of figures at you. Ones that we're really interested in are the bold ones at the bottom, i.e. after all the calculations have been made. Please take my word for it. We have gone through all these calculations with a fine-tooth comb. Our technical department have looked at it. This is as robust as we can possibly make it. So for the purposes of this, if Paula died tomorrow having done nothing, the value of her estate is 7.2 million. The property at 7 million, £100,000 in her savings arrangement, and we've chucked in £100,000 for chattels. That would all be taxed or after the nil rate bands of 650,000. Bearing in mind, of course, we can't use the residence nil rate band for those of you that are familiar, because this property is too big. It's over 3 million, so we can't use it. So we've deducted the full 650,000, which means that the revenue will be sat there going, thank you very much. You're now going to pay us, or your estate is now going to pay us £2.62 million, which means the net wealth transfer in this instance would still be a nice 4.5 million, but there's been a fair chunk of tax paid. So let's look at the same scenario. So Paula died tomorrow, but she had effected the lifetime mortgage and the discounted gift trust arrangement. First thing we've got to bear in mind is, of course, that the lifetime mortgage was a gift. That gift has now failed, so it becomes a failed pet. So we have to add that back in. So all this kind of stuff, if you'll take my word for it, once we've added in the nil rate bands and all the rest of it, and the tax, etc., 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 we've taken into account the discount on the bonds and the value of the bond in trust. The figure we're really interested in is the one at the bottom, the net wealth transfer. If she had effected the strategy and died one day later, her net wealth transfer would have been not 4.5 million, but 4.8 million. So in other words, a saving of 220,000 just in one day, just because of the discount offered by the discounted gift trust. But of course, what we want is for her to survive at least 7 years, because then everything becomes more tax efficient, because gifts fall out of tax calculations, etc., etc. So let's have a look at a scenario, the same scenarios, but Paula dies in 10 years' time. Again, you're going to have to take my word for it. We've increased things in line with inflation. We took a lot of time to make sure that any inflated figures we put in there were realistic. So we reckon in 10 years' time, Paula's estate would now be worth not 7.2, but 9.3 million. So the revenue would be sat there going, whoopee, thank you very much. You're now going to pay us not 2 point whatever it was, but 3.45 million. So the net wealth transfer in 10 years' time would still be a tasty 5.87 million, but included in that would have been nearly £3.5 million worth of tax. So what difference would it have made 10 years later if the strategy was in place? Well, again, I'm not going to talk you through all of these figures. If you'll please take my word for it that we've gone through them with a fine-tooth comb. We've added in some growth because we've compounded the interest on the lifetime mortgage. That's now at 1.34 million, not a million, etc., etc., etc. What we're looking at here are the most important figures in bold at the bottom, that the net wealth transfer to her sons and grandchildren would be not 5.8 million, but just over £7 million. Now, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, we're 10 years in, the strategy's been in place to save money, and we're still looking at about 200 something odd thousand. Whilst that's not to be sniffed at, it's not a huge amount of money, and it hasn't changed a huge amount since day one. But what you've got to bear in mind is that during that 10-year period, Paula was receiving 5% interest from her bonds on a tax deferred basis. So there's another £500,000 in tax efficient cash income that was paid to Paula over that 10 year period. So in my opinion, this thing has done the trick. It's done the trick from a tax perspective, and it's done the trick from an income perspective. But because this is a relatively newish strategy, there will be some questions, particularly if your compliance teams aren't familiar with this, that you'll have to overcome. So please expect compliance teams initially to go, whoa, hang on a minute, we've not seen this strategy, this planning before. And they might be asking questions like, is it appropriate to use a lifetime mortgage to facilitate a potential IHT tax planning or tax saving arrangement? What about additional income for discretionary spending? All these kind of factors might have to be built in. Is it was the trust that was used the most appropriate trust? Was it a proprietary trust or one from an investment provider? All this kind of stuff will have to be covered off if your compliance teams are not familiar with this as a strategy. But hopefully I've demonstrated in that first example that at the very least, even for high net worth individuals, using lifetime mortgages as a wealth distribution strategy should at the very least be considered. Let's look at another one. This is our last case study, and this is a much simpler arrangement. This is basically a gift, a straightforward gift. Here we've got a family. Harold and Jean are both 65. Their son Peter, their only son Peter, is 40, and he is now married to their daughter-in-law Paula, who's age 39. Hopefully the picture indicates that these guys are okay. They're comfortable. They're not at the very top of the high net worth stratosphere. I'll show you their assets in just a second, but hopefully the picture indicates these guys are okay. So what have they got? They've got a property at 1.5 million, and they've also got £1 million in a flexible drawdown, which has been crystallized. They took the whole of the tax-free cash last year, so they're very comfortable at the moment because they've got 330,000 pounds worth of cash slopping around in their account, which they're using for their daily living, to play their golf, etc., etc. So they're okay. They're comfortable. They've also got some old age pension to be paid in the next year or so, depending on whether they will the wife was a waspie or whatever. Anyway, hopefully you get my point. In addition to that, they've also got a small amount in an ISA, small amount in a savings portfolio, and their advice to their advisor is they don't want to touch those. They are there in case they need them at some point in the future. So again, we're going to assume that all the other alternatives have been covered off, and that equity release in this instance is a decent strategy to consider. So these guys have an estate before tax at 2.6 million. They are concerned that they want to try and distribute as soon as they can, as much as they can, to their son and daughter-in-law to mitigate IHT. So with that in mind, what they need to consider, bearing in mind they don't want to touch their two smaller assets, is, well, do they use the pension asset or do they use the property asset on the previous slide? So I want to look at similar scenarios to the ones that we did with Paula, but using these two strategies instead. So using up the pension fund, they've got every right to do that, of course, because it's in flexi drawdown. They can access that and after taxes, all the rest of it, and do what they like with that money. They can access that at any time. The same, of course, with their property via a lifetime mortgage. So what we've calculated is that if they use the pension fund, currently at £1 million or thereabouts, if they wanted to withdraw all of that in one go and then do with it as they feel fit, in this example, distribute to the son and daughter-in-law, we reckon they could get their hands on about £565,000. So we're going to use that as the amount going forward. So bearing that in mind, same scenario as we looked at previously. Let's assume that they used a strategy of the pension fund and then the lifetime mortgage, but they died in this example after 1 year. Unfortunately, they were both involved in a car accident. What would be the scenario after 1 year? So in this example, they've used the pension fund. So what you can see is we've got a bit of growth on the house, a bit of growth on the ISA and the savings. Obviously, there's nothing in the pension pot because they've given that away. So we know that their estate value was 1.6. This time we can use residence nil rate band. So we're going to assume that the full 350,000 is available. We're also going to assume that the full 650,000 is available from the standard nil rate band. Of course, what we've got to do is add back in the lifetime mortgage, because that's now a failed pet. So after all of that, the bill now to the revenue would be 480,000, which leaves us with a net estate to go to the son and daughter-in-law by using this strategy of 1.156 million. Same scenario, but they used lifetime mortgage. The big difference here, of course, is that within the assets at the top, we've got the pension fund is back in there. What's the beauty of pension funds on death? Are they assessed for IHT? No, they're not. So there's one huge advantage already. So what you can see is that we've taken into account the various reliefs, etc., etc. And what that means is that in this example, after just 1 year, which is not the strategy that we really wanted, that we've now got, we've increased the net value of the estate from, what was it, 1.1 million to 1.845 million. Now that's 1 year later. So already you can see where I'm going with this. Oh, one thing I do want to stress here is that when I put these figures together on this case study, I genuinely had no idea how this was going to work out. I genuinely didn't. So it was as much a surprise to me as it may be to you guys to actually see the figures here. So let's assume in this scenario that it worked in terms of the period, because we wanted them to survive this magical 7-year period, because we want the pet to become exempt. So let's assume that they had this unfortunate car accident 8 years later. Again, using the pension scenario, we've increased everything now by a further 7 years worth of growth, so we've got it all in there. So let's have a look at the most important figure. Now we're looking at a net distribution to the son and daughter-in-law of not 1.1 but 1.5 million. And you think, okay, that's done a decent job. It's significantly more. But what about using the lifetime mortgage strategy? Because the biggest advantage here, of course, is that the pension fund is still available. The pension fund isn't taxable on death, so we can add that into scenario as well. So what you can see is that after all of that, we've now managed to reduce the IHT bill right down to £69,000, which means that the net value in this example would not be 1.8, whatever it was. Hang on, let me just go back. 1.55. We're now looking at a scenario of 2.4. So virtually £1 million difference in the net distribution of that estate, simply by adopting a lifetime mortgage strategy and using that as a gift. If after 7 years anything happens, it's done its job in terms of it's now a fully exempt gift, and in my opinion, it's done its job. So I'll leave you to draw conclusions about that. All I would ask is that going forward, if you are talking to high net worth individuals, or you are talking to people who haven't high net worth parents, have they considered using this as a strategy? I fully appreciate it's not going to be right for everybody, and there will be other considerations that will need to be made, but it works. I think that's the point. And therefore, as a scenario, I would be disappointed if this isn't at the very least mentioned to higher net worth individuals and any grandparents that are considering intergenerational wealth planning in whatever form. It can be an extremely tax efficient way of doing things. But as I've mentioned here on point 6, please check your compliance team view on the use of equity release in gifting and investments. As long as it's going into a bond within a trust, that won't be a problem. What your clients can't do, of course, is take the money out and invest in an investment portfolio. That is an absolute no-no. So with that in mind, those are my learning objectives. Hopefully you're comfortable that I've covered all of those off. I won't go through them in detail again. Just to say, I hope there was something over the last 35, 40 minutes or so that was of value to you, if only to have made you think about what equity release is, how equity release can be used, because there are so many advantages for the right clients that equity release can provide. So with that in mind, I'm going to say thank you for listening. If there is anything that's come out of this that you want further information on, please access my colleague George on that web address, and she will happily take up any inquiries or any further questions that you might have. With that in mind, there's the most important screen of all. I'm going to leave that one up and say thank you for listening. All the very best.